Oh boy, do I have something spicy for you today. Now, I mentioned in the last video that the first Ground Forces event vehicle is going to be a variant of the Puma with a 75mm gun. Sadly, I cannot use the same trick that I use for aircrafts for tanks, since there are no dynamic campaigns for tanks. Thankfully, and with the help of Mike10D, our resident data miner over on Reddit, and by the way, huge shout out to Mike, you are a goddamn rockstar. We have been able to get our hands on this thing a little bit early, let's say. Now, before I go ahead, I do want to clear up some things. First of all, in the last video about the P43, it seems like the flight model was still a placeholder flight model. In fact, it seems like it was using the flight model of a P47 D25 or D27. As such, the P43 that's going to be actually in the game will probably not perform quite as well as was shown in the video. Secondly, this also extends to all these vehicles now, like this Puma, and also the Type 65, which we are going to show tomorrow. This is pretty much early on looks. It isn't guaranteed that either the models or everything else is finished. In fact, you're going to see in the video that, for example, we don't have the icons for the ammo types yet. This is all very, very early stuff, and as such, don't judge the performance too much. Another thing I want to mention is that this isn't actually a Puma. The Puma was the name given to the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/2, the one we already have in the game with the 15mm cannon. That is the Puma. This thing has a 75mm Pak 40 gun. It is designated the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/4. It is in fact the last variant of the 234, and this one is called the Packwagen. So let's talk a little bit about the history of this vehicle and then see how it performs in the game. Armored wheeled vehicles were developed early in Germany, since they were not subject to the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. Die Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234 belonged to the ARC series, which is the designation of the chassis. And it was the successor to earlier Sonderkraftfahrzeug 231, 232, 233s, which belonged to the GS series. The combat experience of fast-moving, hard-hitting wheeled reconnaissance vehicles during the Wehrmacht's early invasions of Poland and France quite impressed the German military officials, but it indicated some of the deficiencies in existing designs. A new armored car project was thus undertaken in August 1940, incorporating several lessons from the Wehrmacht's own external operations. The Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234 was designed later that year. It was to have a monocoque chassis with 8 wheels and an air-cooled engine for use in North Africa. Now, the parts for the tank were built just all over the place. The chassis were built in Leipzig, the armored bodies were provided by the Deutsche Edelstahlwerke in Krefeld, the turrets were made by Daimler-Benz in Berlin, and the engine were made by the Ringhofer Tatra-Werke in Nesseldorf. The vehicle had 8-wheel steering and was able to quickly change direction thanks to a second rear-facing driver's seat. The transmission had 6 forward and reverse gears, with traction over the 8 wheels. Power was provided by the air-cooled Tetra 103 diesel engine. Of course, the most well-known version of this vehicle is the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/2, the Puma, which has the 5cm L60 gun. This gun was originally intended for the VK1602 Leopard light tank and was produced from late 1943 to mid-1944. There were 2 other variants other than the ones we are going to now see in the game. The Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234-1 had a 20mm cannon, whilst the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234-3 had a 75mm short cannon, much like a howitzer really, which was intended to be used against soft targets like soldiers, artillery pieces, stuff like that. The final variant produced, which is what we are seeing right now, is the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 2344, which replaced the L24 gun with the 75mm L46 Pak 40. This gun is in fact slightly better than the 75mm gun featured on the Panzer IV F2. This was yet another attempt at increasing the mobility of this anti-tank gun. However, the 234 chassis was stretched to its limits, and this variant was manufactured from the end of 1944 to the end of hostilities in 1945 only. Now, the Packwagen does not have a fully fledged turret. In fact, it is an open-topped vehicle. It's essentially just a gun feeder stuck onto the chassis of the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234. As such, you do have a limited traverse. Now, yesterday I voiced my fears of how this tank would perform based on how well the gun could traverse, given that being on a wheeled chassis, it cannot rotate on the spot like a normal tank with threads can, which makes aiming guns a little bit more complicated. And especially since the chassis of the 234 is so hard to control, especially at speeds, if you're not using the cruise control, the driver assistance mode, it would have been quite hard to use this thing. Now, thankfully, it does actually have a pretty generous gun traverse. It really isn't all that bad. You don't have to be facing directly forwards in order to aim your gun. You can have a slight angle on, which is great news for any of the German tanks that don't want to use this thing. The chassis itself is identical to the Pumas, having a decent acceleration both forwards and backwards, having the same speed backwards as forwards actually. The 8-wheel steering makes it very maneuverable if you are using the driver assistance mode, but also very hard to control if you're only using mouse and keyboard by itself. The gun can be fired on the move, although the reload is going to be a slightly slower than the 50mm cannon, as is to be expected. However, it does also pack a little bit more of a punch. The Packwagen has access to 4 different shell types. The first shell type is the Panzergranate 39 APCBC shell. This shell has an HE filler and has a maximum penetration of 147mm at 0 meters range, trickling down to about 118mm at 1 kilometer. This is going to be a standard all-round shell to be used at most, if not all ranges really. The second shell type is an APCR shell. This is a solid shot with 197mm of penetration on flat armor at 0 meters distance. This is going to be an option against heavier armored tanks with flat surfaces, stuff like if you're facing off against KV-1s at longer ranges. But keep in mind that APCR has problems when it comes to angled armor and will bounce off even off of T-34s. The third shell type is a Sprenggranate 34. This is your run-of-the-mill HE shell. It is lower of a caliber, mostly useless. It can be used against maybe Russian AA trucks, but not much else really. And finally, the fourth type of shell is a heat shell. This has only 80mm of penetration at all ranges, and is pretty much identical to the heat shell that's found on the other 75mm guns of the Germans. Additional to the main cannon, you also have a machine gun on the top. I'm not quite sure which type of machine gun this is, but I can tell you pretty confidently that the caliber is going to be a 7.92mm. It's not going to be useful against tanks or aircraft really all that much. You can maybe scare off some aircraft, you can maybe kill some crew of an open-topped vehicle, but other than that, the machine gun is mostly going to be used for spotting. Now overall, this vehicle feels interesting, let's just say that. This is pretty much going to be the definition of a glass cannon, really. In fact, from what Mike10D has been able to gather, this vehicle is going to be hull breakable, which means that you probably should avoid getting hit by big caliber guns. Add that to, well, the chassis itself having pretty much no armor, and you not being able to drive this thing backwards while still using the gun like you can on the Puma to use the engine as cover. This is one very fragile tank. It also has some problems with gun depression. It is by far not the worst kind of gun depression, but it's still going to force you to expose most of your tank if you want to hill snipe or hill crest. That being said, the vehicle has the potential to move around the map very quickly. Now of course, given that this is a wheeled tank destroyer, it is not very good on off-road terrain. It is going to be quite slow on muddy terrain, like you can see on the video. The maximum I got up to was like 40 km per hour, given that this is very rough terrain overall. But you can expect to get around 60 km per hour on flat, even surfaces like streets and stuff like that. Which is pretty much the same thing you can do with the Puma. Now where the strength of the Packwagen really lies is in fact in the cannon, which is really the main selling part of this whole vehicle. The 75mm Pak 40 is insanely good. at the lower battle ratings. And in fact, they can even be up-tiered and still be quite good. Now, so battle rating is going to depend. Rumors are this is going to be a 2.7 battle rating tank, which makes it extremely good. Imagine getting down-tiered into 1.7 matches in this thing. But again, given that it is a glass cannon that completely relies on the ability of the gun, honestly it makes sense as well. And honestly, there's just kind of something fascinating about being able to see the cannon just move around in an open-top vehicle. It really is quite nice, and it just looks absolutely sexy as well. But that's going to be it for this preview. Hopefully you guys now know if you actually want to go for this vehicle in the upcoming operations, which should be coming very, very soon. I can't see it taking more than a week for the operations to start. It might even start tomorrow. That would be kind of neat. Anyways lads, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. I will be leaving some more gameplay running in the background just so you guys can see the vehicle in action with some nice background music, but it's going to be the end of the commentary. Thank you very much for watching this video. My name is MikeGoesBoom, and I'll see you in the next one.
Take a deeper breath and give it time. You can walk the path among the lines with your shattered frame of mind. Or instead you could always stay. We can wait right here and play until somehow you can find